Like a lot of people, I'm deeply excited about what the lovely folks at Larian accomplished with Baldur's Gate 3, but I want to gently preemptively push back against players taking that excitement and using it to apply criticism or a race standard to RPG going forward. Baldur's Gate 3 isn't a new standard, it's a distinct experience. So, what makes something distinct in the gaming industry? To answer that question, let's go back to October 26 in 2007, a time far removed from the Baldur's Gate we're about to discuss. That's when The Witcher, created by CD Projekt Red, was introduced with one of the most iconic protagonists of all time, Geralt of Rivia. Geralt is one of the first main characters to have a fully voiced personality, which sounds simple in today's gaming industry, but at that time it was something entirely new and distinct. Most games during that period often featured silent main characters, or didn't give them any defined personality traits. Even famous titles like Halo were not exceptions. That's when the industry's existing standards permanently changed. His distinctiveness became the vanguard for the gaming industry standards in a new era. Thanks to this distinctiveness, characters like The Last of Us's Ellie or Arthur of Red Dead Redemption could come to life. And indeed, distinctiveness or new standards aren't radically different. It's just a matter of how someone uses them to cover up their own shortcomings. Because, distinctiveness is one of the first factors in achieving something new, something no one has thought of before. And more importantly, it's about being different. And that very difference is the top standard that has propelled the gaming industry to develop into what we know today. If someone says it's too difficult and they can't do it, there's always someone out there, someone passionate enough who will overcome any challenges to make it happen. And this is precisely the story I want to share with you today. So grab your favorite drink and join FG Mania on today's journey into the world of Divinity, Baldur's Gate 3, and Larian, along with the wonders they have brought to the vast gaming industry. To achieve something great, you'll need passion. I have had several encounters with Larian's team members through various relationships, and there's one simple observation about them. It must be said that most of them are incredibly passionate about what they're doing, probably the most passionate people in the world, and they don't really hide it. If you've been following Larian, especially their recent Panel from Hell sessions, you'll understand what I mean. Everything started in 1996 when Swin Vinke luckily got a ticket to the ECTS trade show, somewhat like Europe's E3. They had in their hands a floppy disk containing a product they had barely started working on, along with some gameplay description images. They had in their hands a floppy disk containing a product they had barely started working on, along with some gameplay description images. They went around the trade show introducing it to everyone they could, hoping to make some money. A senior Atari employee happened to notice and offered them their first contract, a contract worth only $50,000. And that's how Larian Studio was founded, with their first project called Ragnarok Endless, also unknown at the time, much like the studio itself. Why was it unknown? Because fundamentally, it hadn't officially been born yet. Shortly after, they faced a setback when Atari decided not to make PC games anymore. Specifically, Atari's CEO at the time, Jack Tramiel, unfortunately passed away from a heart attack. The company was subsequently sold to JTS, and JTS told Swin that the contract they had hoped for no longer existed. Swin's companion at the time decided to withdraw, leaving Swin determined to continue pursuing his passion. From what little they had started with Ragnarok Endless, Swin joined forces with a few other friends and began working on a game called The Lady, the Mage, and the Knight, alongside an RTS project called Lead Wars. During that time, everyone was making RTS games. The Lady, the Mage, and the Knight secured investment and distribution contracts with Arctic Entertainment. Meanwhile, Lead Wars received a similar deal with Ionos, marking the studio's first minor success. Soon after this first success, the other friend Swin had brought in decided to withdraw, believing that the greater the ambition, the higher the risk. Swen continued his journey with the studio. Thanks to the minor success of Lead Wars, he could rent a room for the studio, or more precisely, a small room that used to be an electronics store storage area. This room didn't even have windows and had only one entrance. Moreover, all the furniture inside, used by the studio's employees, was made from Coca-Cola, cans that they had consumed. Yes, I'm not kidding. Their chairs and desks were made from Coca-Cola cans stuffed into a piece of wood on top. By the way, saving up these Coca-Cola cans was their backup fund. If they needed money, they would sell them as recyclables. The studio was so poor that when Swen's car ran out of gas on the way to work, he couldn't do anything because his bank account had a zero balance. There were times when Swen didn't even have the money to pay his employees weekly contracts. Studio members primarily worked on a weekly contract basis, and every Friday afternoon, they had to renew their contracts for the following week because they didn't know when their last week of work would be. Of course, there were times when Swen received direct refusals from his employees at the end of a week, saying that they had had enough. Actually, it might not have been a big deal if Larian had decided to release their products earlier and fund themselves that way. However, they didn't do that. But in Swen's own words, they wanted to touch the sky. They had their own ambitions and passions. And if they were going to release their brainchild, it had to be perfect, or at least satisfy them first. It's quite amusing, isn't it? That's both their greatest weakness and their greatest strength. What has helped them get to where they are today is also what makes them uncompromising. For now, let's set aside the financial struggles. They put all their determination into perfecting their first major project, the Lady, the Mage, and the Knight.
The legend of the Mage Wars tells of 3 heroes who gave their lives in saving a people from imminent apocalypse. Those of the island Roulat became victims of a war between might and magic. They starved and died and would have lost all if it hadn't been for a lady elf, an apprentice mage, and a young knight. With bravery, wisdom, and grace, they took up this losing battle against black magic, against beings from hell, against strange natural forces. Together, they defy all danger and strike back at the forces of evil. Courage and determination carry them to their destiny. The people of Roulat will marvel at the story of the 3 heroes forever. LMK, the Lady, the Mage, and the Knight.
This game aimed to offer gameplay similar to Diablo with a rare and pioneering land coupe feature. As the name suggests, it allowed you to use 3 characters, the Lady, the Mage, and the Knight, to embark on a journey. The game is set on an island with a colossal tower in the center, offering numerous world interactions from exploration to dungeons and even hidden bosses. It even had beautiful graphics that defied the limitations of an 8-bit platform, a perfect game for an ambitious vision. But have you ever wondered why you haven't heard of it? Well, that's because it never saw the light of day. Arctic Entertainment, the company that signed a publishing contract for the game at that time, wasn't satisfied. After watching the Diablo 2 trailer, they wanted something grander. Arctic demanded Swen to abandon the 8-bit platform and start from scratch with 16-bit because they believed that was the future. At that time, Diablo 2 had only released a trailer, and not the actual game. To ensure the project's completion, Arctic even sent experts from Germany to support the studio in development. The game was promoted as the Diablo killer on famous game news websites. But ultimately, Arctic Entertainment went bankrupt shortly after. The project was canceled entirely and faded into obscurity. With the main source of funding from Arctic gone, the studio officially fell into despair. With nearly 30 people sinking into crisis, Swen tried everything he could, from small projects to assisting other studio projects, just to keep the small studio afloat and prevent it from collapsing completely. Somehow, he managed to do it. Larian Studio held on until CDV Software, a game distributor in Germany, approached them with a partnership contract. Specifically, they wanted to create an RPG game to compete with the huge wave that Diablo 2 was bringing. Swen quickly agreed and put all the sideline projects aside to focus on this new contract. Part of it was because they now had a big contract in hand, so they didn't need the extra income. The rest was his desire to dedicate himself fully to creating something truly complete, something he hadn't been able to do until then. But if we have to be honest, things weren't entirely smooth. During development, it was fine, but in the late stages, when the game was about to be released, it still had quite a few bugs. Swen believed it needed more time. He wrote a letter to CDV Software requesting a postponement of the game's release, stating that with just a little more time, he could turn it into an excellent game that would sell a lot of copies. Sadly, that letter was used against him in a meeting, forcing Larian Studios to release the game on schedule. They couldn't delay it even for a day because CDV wouldn't invest another penny in the project. From then on, Swen had to lay off staff and reduce the studio size to just 3 people. The game was initially released exclusively in Germany and quickly became a massive success, winning numerous awards, including Game of the Year for PC from GameSpy and RPG World. Divine Divinity incorporated almost all the ideas and features of their earlier project. As Swen mentioned, it was more like a third attempt at making the lady, the mage, and the knight than a completely new game. But it wasn't just that. By reusing old assets, Larian Studios had more time to infuse their ambitions and passions into it. They transformed the combat system into a hack and slash instead of the original point-and-click concept. They also put a lot more emphasis on building a new world, adding nooks, crannies, and mysteries for players to explore. Every corner of the game urged players to satisfy their curiosity and immerse themselves in a vast world. This was all in line with Swen's vision for the game. It combined the action gameplay of Diablo with the branching storytelling of Baldur's Gate. The result was Divine Divinity, a game with a diverse and fascinating narrative system full of choices and consequences. Lastly, we can't overlook one crucial aspect that contributed significantly to Larian's success, both then and now: the music. Compared to games of its time, the music in Divine Divinity was a pinnacle of the gaming industry. With the tremendous success that Spiritual Child brought, Swen Binke could proudly say that he and his Larian had created a game that made everyone smile, except for Larian's own members. The issue was that even though the game was incredibly successful, CDV Software was the one reaping the benefits. Larian itself barely received any money due to contract terms and meetings against Swen. At that point, it seemed like Larian had almost collapsed right next to their biggest success. This was the moment when Swen faced the most critical question of his life. How had the game publisher made money? At the same time, he realized how wrong he had been to cut all the sideline projects and focus on larger ones. By doing so, Larian had become entirely financially dependent on the contract holder. So Swen made a decision about how the studio would operate from that point on. Larian Studio would concentrate on in-house projects. Specifically, they would develop and publish their own sequel to Divinity, titled Beyond Divinity. They would also continue to take on small third-party projects to generate income for the studio and their main project. In Swen's words, the hardest thing he had to do before was to lay off everyone when the studio collapsed. Now he would do anything to ensure that never happened again. He continued to use the old engine and employed his small team to create a sequel to his game. So, when the next Spiritual Child of Larian Studios was officially completed, Swen could finally see his first real financial success in his game development career. Even distributors had to line up to sell the sequel game. Even when Swen wanted to sell the game through his distributors, they had to pre-order and pay for a large number of copies in advance, and they were happy to do so. But it must be said, despite the long lines of fans waiting to buy the game and the positive reviews it received, Beyond Divinity was the worst game Swen had ever made. Not because of his quality, but simply because it was the first game he had to make primarily for money. There was no room for failure at that time. Many features that he and his colleagues wanted to add to the game had to be scrapped. For example, initially, they wanted to create a turn-based game with action points instead of traditional RPG gameplay, but it was tossed aside due to lack of time. They even had to simplify the game's dungeons to complete it quickly and make money as soon as possible. At least during the process, they did manage to introduce something unique. In Beyond Divinity, you had to control 2 characters instead of 1, and use both characters together to solve problems like fighting enemies and solving puzzles. This was a very unique feature and became a precursor to their later massive success, Divinity: Original Sin. But that's a story for another time. Back to the present, thanks to the revenue success of Beyond Divinity, Larian Studios could now revive and pursue their dream. This was when they entered a new era in the gaming industry, the era of 3D games. You know, the early 2000s were a time when the gaming industry was growing rapidly. We had Mass Effect, Warcraft 3, and many other titles that raised gamers' expectations and tastes to new heights. The gaming industry was moving away from traditional top-down and 2D gameplay to explore something new. At this stage, any studio that didn't adapt to the times would likely be crushed, and Larian Studios understood this better than anyone. They were one of the most ambitious game developers out there. Swen and his team couldn't accept the idea of making the same type of game repeatedly. They wanted to grow, to aim higher. In a time when people were just getting a grasp of 3D technology, Swen and his team decided to create a game with the original idea of allowing players to become a dragon, literally, and engage in free-flight combat in a fully 3D environment. This was considered a crazy and impractical idea at the time. Even now, apart from big AAA studios, not many dare to attempt it. However, as the ideas and ambitions for this game grew, it became too vast. To have enough resources to continue developing this dream game, Swen decided to go back to the traditional route and seek a partner willing to invest and publish the project. Another German company, DTP Entertainment, agreed to collaborate. During this time, the Xbox 360 was released, which elevated Larian's dream to a new level. They now had the opportunity to create a dream game for both Xbox and PC. Not only that, they aimed for a seamless game in the action RPG market and began designing branching quest lines, a linear storyline with depth and meaning. They didn't want simple quests. The first 3D game they developed was also the first one made for consoles. It featured a relatively large open world with authentic quest lines for players to explore their desires, and most importantly, allowed players to transform into a dragon and freely fly. Something truly unique in the gaming industry during the early 2000s. DTP Entertainment has repeatedly requested Larian to abandon most of their ideas, as they believed that action RPG didn't require such elements and took too much time to implement. Things weren't too bad initially, but by 2008, the global economy fell into a crisis as numerous banks declared bankruptcy, accompanied by Western governments refusing to bail out everything. And as you might know from a small fire, it gradually became one of the worst economic crises in history, with millions of people losing their jobs and countless businesses teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, ultimately closing their doors. DTP Entertainment couldn't stay out of this crisis, as they were right on the front lines. This forced them to make a decision that the game Larian was working on had to be released much sooner than planned. Once again, this put Swen and his team in a difficult position because making a game is not as simple as picking fruit from a tree. It's not about developing it and releasing it whenever you want. But due to contractual obligations, they had to make an effort to complete their game within just a few weeks and release it to the market. And that's how Divinity 2 came into being. Can you guess the consequences of such a rush? The game received mixed reviews, even with their forward-thinking ideas and regardless of the quality of its gameplay. Most criticisms revolved around 2 main issues. The first and most important one was that the game was fantastic in its early hours of play. But when players reached the middle part of the game, it became a completely different story, with the quality plummeting even faster than a falling plane. Imagine playing The Witcher 3 and suddenly, in the middle of the game, it turns into Forspoken. Actually, it's not hard to understand because they only developed the early part of the game. When they received the release order, the game was only in its early stages and both the middle and the final parts had to be redone and rushed to meet the deadline. The second remaining reason was bugs. The game had a multitude of bugs. Due to severe time constraints and a lack of post-production, any bug that didn't directly affect the main storyline was overlooked, and they sold the game with those bugs to customers. This angered many players who had to pay for a flawed game, and it was even worse than some of Bethesda's worst games during that period. Disappointment and frustration started to appear on the faces of Larian Studios team members. Some even decided that they had had enough and submitted their resignations. During this time, there were even physical altercations in the studio due to conflicts surrounding the release of Divinity 2. And you can probably guess that Swen was extremely dissatisfied with Divinity 2. It was like the worst stain on everything I tried to achieve. They had a beautiful dream and great ideas, and they put their trust, dedication, and hard work into it, only to see it become something that would never come true. Could anything be worse than that? That's when Swen decided that enough was enough. He reviewed everything they had achieved with Divinity 2, gathered what was working well, and rallied the remaining team members for a new journey. A journey to reclaim their own dream. A journey to put Larian's spirit back where it belonged. And just 2 years later, Divinity Director's Cut was born and published by Focus Home Interactive. The game delivered almost all the dreams that the Larian team had put into it and was warmly received with both critical acclaim and commercial success. It became one of the most iconic RPG ever made. To this day, you can try buying the game when it's on sale, and I believe it won't disappoint you, even compared to modern games. More than that, it proved that with time, they could turn their dream into reality. After everything they went through with Divinity 2, the people at Larian decided to sit down together once again to figure out the reasons for their past issues and failures. The answer was straightforward. They couldn't work with third parties, specifically investors and game publishers. Anytime someone else interfered with what they were doing, it led to a disaster, one way or another. They were artists and they needed the freedom to create their vision. That's when Swen decided that Larian needed to become independent and stand on its own 2 feet. However, making that happen was a completely different story. Fortunately for them, Divinity 2 Director's Cut sold enough copies to make independence a real possibility, not just a distant dream. And that's when Larian continued on its journey to achieve its ambitions. In the following phase, Larian's studio planned to develop 3 projects simultaneously. The primary goal remained that if one of them failed, the second and third would hopefully compensate for it. The 3 projects included Divinity Dragon Commander, an idea from Divinity 2 that allowed players to control dragons and engage in aerial combat while managing bases and commanding troops, and a hybrid RTS game. Next was a puzzle game for kids called Monkey Tales. Finally, there was Divinity, Eyes of a Child, a more traditional action RPG following in the footsteps of Beyond Divinity. It was a small, short game with about 10 to 20 hours of gameplay, fixed characters, and a linear story. Initially, most of the studio's resources were devoted to Dragon Commander, as it seemed to be the most promising project. However, when Dragon Commander was officially released, it turned out to be a disaster. The game had good ideas and relatively interesting gameplay, but it tried to combine too many genres, making it difficult and less appealing compared to other games in its genre. Although it didn't result in a financial loss, the earnings from Dragon Commander couldn't sustain the studio. This forced Larian to fall back on their backup plan, which was to focus on the remaining 2 projects, Monkey Tales and Divinity, Eyes of a Child. This is where Swen made a decision that would change Larian's studio forever. He decided not to make action RPG anymore and to turn Divinity into a turn-based game, as he had originally intended with Beyond Divinity. At the same time, Swen and his team added many new ideas. So in the end, the little game that was supposed to be just another action RPG became something much bigger. something that most of us have heard of at least once, whether we've played it or not. Divinity: Original Sin. The initial stage of development primarily focused on defining the ideas and ambitions they wanted to incorporate into the game. They wanted a world that was vast and interactive, filled with mysteries for players to discover. It had to make players pay attention to their surroundings, apply environmental elements, and engage with the in-game world to progress. They decided that the story should be told to the game world itself, with player interactions, pieces of paper, and the choices players made contributing to the narrative. Every player interaction, every piece of evidence, and every choice would shape the story. They wanted the games to offer a wide range of choices for players to create their own story. Next, they had to decide how the combat should be structured. They initially opted for a simple combat system to avoid complicating things for players. However, they planned to gradually expand and refine it throughout the game's development to create a unique combat system that nobody else had ever done before. But even with their track record, this project still faced many challenges. As the saying goes, the higher you aim, the harder you fall. And Divinity: Original Sin was certainly aiming high. Creating an expansive, interactive world filled with meaningful choices, a dynamic and engaging combat system, and a compelling story is no small feat. But as you might guess, Larian Studios was not one to shy away from challenges. They had already overcome numerous hurdles in their journey so far, and they were determined to overcome any obstacles that lay ahead. And with Swen's leadership and the dedication of the Larian team, they set out on the arduous path to create what would become a modern classic in the world of RPG. Thanks to the money earned from Original Sin, just within 1 year from a studio with about 40 people, Larian Studio has now been able to expand its scale. As a result, their branches in Ghent, Petersburg, Dublin, and Quebec were born. At this point, they have a total of 4 studios, including the parent studio in Ghent. Expanding suddenly like this also brought many challenges because Swen needed to figure out how to organize his studio more effectively, thus changing their somewhat freestyle working style. But everything eventually fell into place after a period of time. 2 out of the 4 studios, St. Petersburg and Ghent, were separately assigned to create the original Sin Enhanced Edition for Xbox One and PS4. Quebec, on the other hand, was responsible for researching and developing Original Sin 2. Mainly research because this was an entirely new studio and had no prior experience with Divinity. It wasn't until around October 2015 that the Enhanced Edition, the first part, was completed and released. Larian Studio then focused all its efforts on their next big project. The first thing in the development process was to reflect on what they hadn't done well in the previous game. First and foremost was the story. Swen acknowledged that the main story of Original Sin wasn't all that great. Most game critics also pointed out this issue. Back then, it was a survival project for Larian. They didn't have enough time to come up with a genuinely good story to tell. Instead, they gathered the stories they thought of in the most reasonable way possible. But now, things were different. They had more money, more time, and they had a dedicated studio in Dublin solely for writing the story and releasing the game. Larian also improved their story writing tool at this point with the creation of a dialogue editor software specifically for internal use, featuring a dialogue system and supporting the development of large-scale brand dialogues to make content writers, both old and new, work together more efficiently, even if they were on opposite sides of the ocean. Furthermore, with the idea of creating 6 different original stories, they created 6 independent origin characters to weave into the larger story. You could use them as companions or become them and experience the story from their perspective. But in reality, almost no game had ever done this before, especially when it had to work in multiplayer. They didn't simply borrow ideas from others and patch them into their game. Instead, they invented something entirely new. And when they succeeded, they had genuinely created something new and special. The game's cartoonish art direction also needed to change to make the story more immersive and specific, as Swen put it, to create their own game universe. The color scheme of everything in the game needed to be darker, more mature. Changing that also meant they had to overhaul the game's graphics almost entirely. The initial programming team wasn't too keen on that idea because there was a lot of work they had to do and it would take a lot of time, but slowly it was accepted and they began their own work. The main reason for this change was that they didn't want to keep redoing the same game over and over again. Their next game had to be an evolution from the previous one to make their mark in the large game industry. Next was music. Larian wanted to build a dynamic music system for the game. Divinity: Original Sin was famous for allowing players to make their own choices and choose their own paths. And this time, the game's music had to be tailored to the path the player had chosen to support and inspire them. So from that, players could choose the musical instrument that would play during their journey. Not only that, because there are 6 different origin characters, why should there be only one main team? So they created 7 different main teams for the game, 1 for each character and 1 for all of them together. Besides music, combat was another significant aspect that Swen and his team aimed to enhance. They wanted the game's combat to be an evolution from the previous one and more. Each battle was like a puzzle that players needed to solve with tools they had designed and built. The tools here were the warriors, mages, and archers you created and painstakingly developed. Each battle was a test of your creation. You had to change your approach, use even the smallest things to your advantage. Then you'd solve the puzzle, answer the questions, and move forward. To ensure that every combat in the game was genuinely exciting, Larian had to test every single battle in the game using different methods and giving explanations to themselves dozens of times. According to their employees at that time, each battle took about 1 afternoon to 1 day to create. Then it would be tested dozens of times depending on its importance. Some battles could take weeks of testing with 30 to 40 different tries on the highest difficulty. They wanted the combat to be like dialogues where both sides had to quickly give their responses. In the previous installment, while the combat was done relatively well, the AI back then hadn't truly progressed. Sometimes it was too simple, or sometimes it was too difficult, and could send players to the play again screen in just a few turns. This time it was different. They tried to make the enemies in the game challenging and surprising to the players, but at the same time, they had to ensure that players could always find solutions. For Larian, if you had the chance to spend a day at their studio, you'd probably notice something very special compared to many other studios. Making games was their job, but they weren't here making games because they were forced to. They worked here because they were pursuing their passion and pouring everything they had into their spiritual child. 10 years before Divinity was released, or 10 years after, it probably didn't change much. After all, the game that these people aimed for was a game that players could enjoy and find joy in. A game that would make everyone smile. And that's how we got Divinity, Original Sin 2. Something interesting happened on the day the game was released on September 14th, 2017, when a quarter of Ghent experienced a sudden power outage, including Larian's headquarters. They had to carry their laptops and run to a team member's apartment on the other side of the city to meet the deadline. Fortunately, they managed to complete it just 15 minutes before the official launch on Steam. The successor of those who came before, the game quickly became a global hit, selling 1 million copies in just 3 months, setting a new revenue record for Larian specifically and classic RPG games in general at that time. Moreover, it was named the best RPG at the Game Awards that year. For many people, it was also one of the best RPG games to exist alongside other legends. And that's the story of Larian, the people who made magic in the gaming industry, turning their dreams and ambitions into reality through relentless efforts and unwavering perseverance, no matter how terrible the obstacles were. Now let's move on to the next chapter of their journey.
I'll tell you a story, true soul. My life was dismantled piece by piece. And when I tried to buy it back, it cost me everything. I must finish what I started. Death's design will be complete.
Discover Ketherick's secret. Find out what it is that makes him invincible so we can strip him of his advantage.
You're a pawn, a slave to forces you cannot comprehend.
Ketherick is a frightening man, but you have something he doesn't. Allies worth having.
Together, we will strike down the Absolute.
Bow before me. Bow before the Absolute. Bow!
Baldur's Gate, the game was released on August 31st. But before talking about the game, let's delve into its origins first. To clarify, even though the game is called Baldur's Gate 3, the reality is that the first 2 parts have no connection to Larian at all. The first part was developed by BioWare and Black Isle Studios, published by Interplay Entertainment in 1998, using the D&D rule set for gameplay. The highlight of D&D is the freedom of choice, imagination, and experiencing it in one's own way. Something that was nearly impossible to achieve in video games at that time. And yet, Baldur's Gate, the first part, almost succeeded in doing just that, becoming one of the most iconic RPG games of all time, setting a shining example for many classic RPG games that follow. Its second part, Shadows of Am, also enjoyed tremendous success. However, tragedy struck shortly after Interplay faced an economic crisis, leading to the closure of Black Isle Studios, cancellation of the ongoing project for Part 3, and the disappearance of the Baldur's Gate series from the gaming industry. But luckily, that wasn't permanent. Shortly after Larian released Divinity Original Sin in 2014, they wanted to do something new instead of Part 2, so they decided to reach out to Wizard of the Coast, the company owning the Dungeons & Dragons copyright, and hence Baldur's Gate. At that time, Swen had sent multiple requests to gain permission to develop Part 3 of the game, but they were repeatedly rejected. The simple reason was that Wizard of the Coast believed Larian was too young at that time to continue a series like Baldur's Gate. That rejection led Larian to decide to make Original Sin 2 instead. However, after the success of Original Sin 2, Wizard of the Coast reached out to Swen and asked if he still wanted to make Baldur's Gate 3. Swen quickly agreed, and Larian Studio began developing the biggest and most ambitious game they had ever undertaken. Larian's Baldur's Gate 3 will be a spiritual successor to the first 2 parts. While it shares the same world and some characters from the previous games, it's still a Larian game and told in their own way. Let's talk about the biggest change that Swen and his team have achieved. I'm sure most of you know that Larian's games had a tremendous amount of dialogue, as seen in Original Sin, for example. And now, with Baldur's Gate, most of those dialogues have become in-game cutscenes, but not just any low-quality cutscenes. On the contrary, both the voice acting and facial animations are done exceptionally well, even surpassing many AAA games of the current time. Now, with Baldur's Gate, it allows players to truly immerse themselves in the story the game wants to tell, because it's like watching a movie where the choices are yours to make. It makes you feel like you're genuinely stepping into a meticulously crafted D&D world, unlike anything many other games can offer, except for the titans in the industry. Moreover, every NPC you encounter has their own story. They may not have their own independent lives or be entirely autonomous AI, but most NPC in Baldur's Gate 3 have basic conversational abilities. They have a certain backstory, and more importantly, they react to the environment around them dependent on the situation, making the game world, especially the city, feel as authentic as possible. It was confirmed that the game would have about 174 hours of cutscenes. Initially, we thought of it as an overhyped claim, but now it's entirely possible given the use of cutscenes for densely packed dialogues of unimaginable scope. Furthermore, Larian has maintained its approach of allowing players to do what they want and approach the issues in the way that suits them best. Is there a goblin problem in the neighboring village? You can solve it however you want, whether by charging in, negotiating, or even poisoning. When it comes to freedom of choice, this is the second game we've played that places such weight on your decisions. The other game is Pathfinder, often considered the king of CRPG. The way events unfold in Pathfinder assigns consequences to your actions. If you make a mistake, someone else might pay the ultimate price. Sometimes the choices you think are just for fun can lead to severe and irreversible consequences. Moreover, you can even choose to become a villain if you truly desire it. Of course, that comes at the cost of isolation. Romance has also been greatly improved compared to the previous game. It's not just about completing a character's quest. Now, to make a character fall in love with you, you must give them a reason to do so. While it might not be as realistic as real-life romance, what the game achieves is pioneering in the field, much like what BioWare's Mass Effect and Dragon Age games did in the past. Combat has evolved significantly from Original Sin 2, with a wide variety of magic spells pushed to their limits. The game had around 200 different spells distributed across the various classes for players to use in different situations. Additionally, Larian has promised over 600 spells, which will be gradually added to the game through next updates. Another important highlight in the evolution of combat is the design of multi-level battlefields. Players have to consider not only the horizontal space, but also the vertical, with high and low ground. This, combined with the detailed environmental design, including traps and obstacles on multiple levels, provides players with more options to use their shares in place to their advantage and avoid pre-existing disadvantages. As you progress, battles become more complex, creating a sense of excitement when you successfully conquer the challenges ahead. Then there are the classes. While Divinity Original Sin 2 already supported multi-classing, Baldur's Gate 3 takes it to a new level with 12 major classes and 46 subclasses at launch. Major classes all support multi-classing, allowing you to create a unique character. For example, you could put 2 levels into Barbarian and then another 2 levels into Wizard. It may sound strange, but it works. The origin character system from the previous game has been reintroduced and integrated into Baldur's Gate 3, allowing you to select some characters as companions or play from their perspective. However, it has been significantly improved. It introduces the concept of a character avatar, which won't appear in the game unless you choose them as your main character. It lets you choose the race and class freely, but it uses the background and story as a regular origin character even deeper, which I'll try to avoid spoiling here. There are still many other features that have been improved and added, such as sound, crafting, graphics, and more, which are too numerous to list. The most significant question now is what happens after Baldur's Gate 3's success. Can a company like Ubisoft create a game like Baldur's Gate 3? The answer is likely yes. They might even do it on a grander scale. However, the key issue here is whether any company is willing to invest the necessary capital and time to accomplish that. When Larian Studios demonstrates to the world that they, an independent studio, can create a game as awe-inspiring as Baldur's Gate 3, even rivaling billion-dollar AAA game companies, how will the gaming industry change? Today's story isn't just about games, divinity, or Baldur's Gate. It's a story about people who can overcome anything for their passion, showing the world that adversity is not a reason to give up. And your dreams are the most significant driving force to propel you forward.